March 14th, 1945, outside Remagen, Germany. A Sherman tank commander receives an order that violates every principle of armoured warfare he learned at Fort Knox. Reverse your tank toward the enemy. Present your rear armour to their guns. Drive backward into direct fire. The German Panther 400 yards ahead has already knocked out 2 Shermans in the last 6 minutes. Its 88mm gun can penetrate the Sherman's frontal armour at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. The mathematics are brutal and simple. The Panther kills Shermans at distances where Shermans cannot effectively kill Panthers. This is not a fair fight. This is applied physics with fatal consequences. But Lieutenant James McPherson, commanding the lead tank of Baker Company, 3rd Armoured Division, shifts into reverse. His 33-ton Sherman begins rolling backward down a slope at 4 miles per hour, its rear armour facing the German gun. His crew thinks he has lost his mind. The German gunner tracking him through optics believes the American tank is malfunctioning or its crew is panicking. Neither is correct. McPherson is executing a tactic that should not work according to every manual written about tank warfare, a tactic that exploits geometry and physics in ways armour doctrine never anticipated, a tactic discovered by accident 3 weeks earlier when a Sherman commander made a desperate mistake that somehow kept him alive. Sometimes the best armour is not the thickest steel. Sometimes it is the angle nobody expects. If you are enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Colonel Harley Doane stood in the turret of his command, Sherman, on February 20th, 1945, watching another American tank brew up 600 yards ahead. The ammunition fire sent flames 40 feet into the grey German sky. Black smoke marked the 3rd Sherman lost, that morning, to a single concealed Panther that had turned this stretch of approach road into a killing gallery. The tactical situation represented every American tanker's nightmare. German heavy armour in prepared defensive positions, engaging American medium tanks across open ground, where superior German optics and gun range created mathematical certainty. The Panther's frontal armour measured 120 mm at maximum thickness. Its 88mm Quai-K 42 Leipzig gun could penetrate 138 mm of armour at 500 yards. The Sherman's frontal armour measured 63.5 mm at the upper glacis. Its 75 mm dry gun could penetrate approximately 92 mm of armour at 500 yards, sufficient to kill a Panzer Mark IV from the front, marginally effective against a Panther's side armour, and essentially useless against a Panther's frontal plate at combat ranges. This was not a design flaw. This was industrial mathematics. American doctrine emphasized reliability, mechanical durability, and production volume over individual tank superiority. The United States built 49,000 Shermans during World War II. Germany built approximately 6,000 Panthers. American strategy accepted trading 3 or 4 Shermans for 1 Panther because America could build replacements faster than Germany could count casualties. That mathematics worked at the strategic level, where industrial capacity determined ultimate victory. It offered limited comfort to tankers whose individual Sherman happened to be one of the 3 or 4 in the exchange ratio. Colonel Doane had spent 19 months in the European theatre. He understood armour warfare with the practical clarity that only sustained combat provides. Speed and manoeuvre worked when terrain allowed flanking approaches. Artillery and air support worked when weather permitted coordination. Infantry support worked when you had sufficient dismounted troops to suppress anti-tank weapons. But sometimes, terrain channeled your advance into narrow approaches. Sometimes weather-grounded aircraft and obscured observation for artillery. Sometimes infantry was committed elsewhere, and you faced German armour across open ground, with nothing but your own tank's capabilities. In those moments, doctrine offered clear guidance. Withdraw to covered positions. Call for artillery support. Wait for combined arms coordination. Do not engage superior enemy armour in direct frontal duels, where their advantages in optics, gun range, and armour protection guaranteed their victory. The guidance was sound. built on thousands of tank engagements across North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and France. The guidance also assumed you had the luxury of withdrawal, time for coordination, and alternative approaches. Baker Company had none of these things. They were committed to holding this approach against German counterattacks, threatening the Remagen bridgehead, the only intact crossing over the Rhine that American forces had captured. Withdrawal meant surrendering ground that had cost hundreds of casualties to secure. Waiting meant allowing German reinforcements to consolidate positions. The third Sherman that burned that morning belonged to Lieutenant William Brennan, a tank commander who had survived since Normandy through a combination of tactical skill and statistical luck. His crew bailed out successfully. All 4 men reached American lines with minor injuries. Brennan's after-action report, delivered to Colonel Doan while smoke still rose from his destroyed tank, contained a detail that initially seemed like a curiosity rather than a tactical insight. The Panther's killing shot had struck Brennan's Sherman on the upper frontal glacis, the sloped armor plate that formed the tank's front face. But in the final seconds before the hit, Brennan had been maneuvering to retreat, shifting into reverse back away from the engagement. His tank had been in the process of turning when the shell arrived. The penetration came at the glacis, but the angle of impact was not perpendicular. The German gunner had aimed at a target beginning to turn away, and the shot arrived when the Sherman's orientation was perhaps 15 to 20 degrees off the German gun's direct line. The shell penetrated and destroyed the tank, but Brennan noted something odd in the report. The delay between seeing the muzzle flash and feeling the impact seemed longer than previous engagements. The penetration seemed less clean. The internal damage appeared more concentrated in one area rather than catastrophic throughout the crew compartment. These were impressions from a man who had just lost his 3rd tank in 5 months, observations made under stress and possibly influenced by survivor's bias. Colonel Doan filed the report with dozens of others documenting the brutal mathematics of Sherman versus Panther, of engagements. He noted the details because thorough officers noted everything, not because he believed they represented anything tactically significant. The revelation came 3 days later from an unexpected source. A maintenance sergeant examining destroyed Shermans at the recovery yard. Technical Sergeant Raymond Porter had spent 26 months in theatre, not fighting tanks but repairing them, studying their wounds, understanding the relationship between where shells hit and what happened to the crews inside. Porter had developed an informal taxonomy of tank kills. Clean penetrations through frontal armor generally meant entire crew losses. Side armor penetrations often left the driver and assistant driver alive if the shell hit behind the turret. Rear hits were catastrophic for engine and transmission, but sometimes allowed crew survival if ammunition did not cook off immediately. Brennan's destroyed Sherman showed a pattern Porter had not seen before. The German shell had struck the upper frontal glacis, but the angle of penetration suggested the tank had been oriented perhaps 20 degrees off perpendicular to the German gun. The shell had hit sloped armor that was already angled at 47 degrees from vertical, but the additional rotation of the tank's orientation had effectively increased that angle. The penetration had occurred, the tank was destroyed, but the internal damage was less severe than comparable frontal hits on tanks oriented directly toward enemy guns. Porter brought his observations to Colonel Doan with the tentative uncertainty of an enlisted man presenting technical analysis to a senior officer. The sergeant did not claim to have discovered a new tactic. He simply noted that angle seemed to matter more than doctrine accounted for, that Sherman crews might gain marginal protection by presenting their frontal armor at angles rather than perpendicular to enemy guns. The marginal protection was not sufficient to stop shells entirely, but it might be sufficient to reduce the catastrophic nature of penetrations, to allow more crews to survive and bail out, to change the engagement from certain death to merely probable severe damage. Doan listened because competent officers listened to experienced sergeants who had earned their expertise through observation rather than reading manuals. He did not immediately see tactical applications, because presenting your frontal armor at an angle meant pointing your own gun away from the enemy, and tanks that could not return fire were targets rather than combatants. but the observation lodged in his mind with the weight of information that felt significant, even if its application remained unclear. On February 23, 1945, Lieutenant James McPherson received his first command, a Sherman via Adrai with a 75mm gun, 4 experienced crew members, and assignment to Baker Company on the approach roads near Remagen. McPherson had trained at Fort Knox for 7 months, studied armor tactics, practiced gunnery, learned maneuver doctrine, and memorized the technical specifications that defined what Sherman tanks could and could not accomplish. He knew that Sherman frontal armor measured 63.5 millimeters on the upper glacis, sloped at 47 degrees from vertical, which provided effective protection equivalent to approximately 95 millimeters against perpendicular hits. He knew that this was insufficient to stop German 88mm rounds from Panthers or Tigers at combat ranges. He knew that Sherman doctrine emphasized mobility, flanking attacks, and combined arms coordination rather than direct frontal engagements with heavier German armor. He knew that knowing these things provided limited utility when terrain, mission, and enemy dispositions forced direct engagements anyway. McPherson's first combat action occurred on February 25th, during a German counterattack that sent 4 Panthers and supporting infantry against Baker Company's positions. The engagement lasted 37 minutes. American forces knocked out 1 Panther with artillery fire and damaged another with coordinated attacks from multiple Shermans exploiting flanking positions. The Germans destroyed 3 Shermans and withdrew when infantry anti-tank teams began threatening their supporting foot soldiers. McPherson's tank survived because the German gunners had focused on other targets, not because he had executed any tactical brilliance. He understood this clearly. Combat was teaching him what training had not adequately conveyed. Survival often depended on being the less important target when German gunners had to prioritize threats. The March engagements increased in intensity as German forces launched increasingly desperate attempts to collapse the Remagen bridgehead before American forces could exploit the Rhine crossing. Baker Company found itself committed to defensive positions where the luxury of maneuver and flanking attacks disappeared behind the necessity of holding specific terrain against armored counterattacks. On March 9th, Colonel Doan assembled his tank commanders for a tactical briefing that deviated significantly from standard armor doctrine. He presented Sergeant Porter's analysis of Brennan's destroyed Sherman, the observation about angle of impact and penetration severity. He proposed a question rather than issuing an order. If angling the tank's frontal armor provided marginal additional protection, could that angle be deliberately created and exploited tactically? The discussion that followed revealed the fundamental problem with the concept. Angling your frontal armor meant turning your hull away from the enemy, which meant turning your gun away from the enemy, which meant you could not effectively return fire while presenting the angled armor. A tank that could not shoot was not a tank. It would be destroyed by patient enemy gunners who could take time to aim precisely at hatches, vision ports, or tracks. Lieutenant Morrison, Baker Company's executive officer, raised the question that changed the discussion's direction. What if you did not turn the tank sideways? What if you reversed it? The Sherman's rear armor was significantly thinner than frontal protection, only 38 millimeters on the rear hull, but the rear engine deck was sloped at 10 degrees, and the rear hull plate behind the engine compartment was vertical. More critically, reversing down a slope would present the rear armor at an angle, determined by terrain rather than by the armor's inherent geometry. If the slope was steep enough, approximately 15 to 20 degrees, reversing down, it would present even the relatively thin rear armor at compound angles that might, possibly, create enough deflection to cause German shells to ricochet rather than penetrate. The theory was speculative, untested, and seemed to violate every principle of armored warfare that emphasized presenting your strongest armor to enemy fire. Colonel Doan did not order anyone to test the tactic. He simply noted that if circumstances forced individual tank commanders into situations where standard doctrine offered no survivable options, perhaps compound angles created through reverse movement down slopes might provide alternatives worth considering. This was how untested tactics entered combat operations. 2. Not through formal doctrine changes and training programs, but through senior officers giving junior leaders permission to improvise when the book was failing. On March 14th, Lieutenant McPherson found himself in exactly the situation where the book offered no survivable options. His Sherman was the lead tank in a column attempting to secure an approach road where a concealed Panther had already killed 2 Shermans in 6 minutes. The German tank's position was known, approximately 400 yards, ahead in a tree line overlooking the road. Its fields of fire dominated the approach. Artillery strikes had failed to destroy it. Infantry could not advance close enough to engage with anti-tank weapons without crossing open ground, swept by German machine guns supporting the Panther. Standard doctrine said, withdraw, wait for combined arms coordination, find an alternative approach. The mission said, hold this road, prevent German reinforcements from threatening the bridgehead, accept the casualties necessary to maintain the position. McPherson sat in his tank commander's position, watching smoke rise from burning Shermans, and thought about compound angles created through reverse movement down slopes. The road his tank occupied ran uphill toward the German position. Behind him, the road descended into a slight depression before rising again. If he reversed down that slope at speed, his tank's rear would present itself to the German gun at an angle determined by the terrain's geometry, plus the 10-degree slope of the engine deck, plus whatever additional angle the reversing movement created through the tank's pitch. The mathematics were uncertain. The tactic was untested. The alternative was sitting still until the German gunner decided McPherson's tank was the next priority target. He ordered his driver to reverse down the slope at maximum speed, 4 miles per hour in reverse gear, with 33 tons of steel rolling backward toward an enemy that was about to shoot at them. The geometry was unfolding in real time. The Sherman's rear engine deck, sloped at 10 degrees, was now descending a terrain slope of approximately 18 degrees, creating a compound angle of roughly 28 degrees from the German gunner's horizontal perspective. The reversing movement added pitch to the tank's orientation, increasing that angle by another 6 to 8 degrees as the front end rose and the rear dropped during the descent. From the German gunner's position he was, watching a Sherman present its rear armour at a compound angle exceeding 30 degrees from horizontal, while simultaneously moving in an unexpected direction. Armour doctrine said rear armour was the weakest point on any tank. Rear shots were preferred targets because they guaranteed penetration and catastrophic kills, but that doctrine assumed rear armour presented perpendicular or nearly perpendicular to the gun's line of fire. McPherson's Sherman was presenting its rear at angles that doctrine never anticipated, because no tank commander had ever deliberately reversed toward enemy fire down slope terrain. The German gunner fired. The 88mm shell covered 400 yards in less than 1 second. The shell struck the Sherman's rear engine deck at a compound angle exceeding 35 degrees from perpendicular. The laws of physics governing projectile impact on sloped armor are mathematically precise. When a shell strikes armor at an angle significantly off, perpendicular, several things happen simultaneously. The effective thickness of the armor increases because the shell must penetrate through more material when traveling at an angle rather than straight through. The shell's kinetic energy distributes differently across the impact surface, reducing the concentration of force at any single point. Most critically, at sufficiently extreme angles, the shell can ricochet, its hardened steel surface skipping off the armor like a stone skipping across water. The German 88mm shell hit the Sherman's rear engine deck and bounced. The impact gouged a deep scar across the armored surface, tore away paint and surface metal, created a sound like a massive hammer striking an anvil, and then the shell careened away at a deflected angle, tumbling through the air beyond the Sherman before impacting harmlessly in earth 50 yards behind the tank. Inside the Sherman, the crew felt the impact as a massive shock transmitted through the tank structure. The sound was deafening even through the headsets. For a moment, every man inside believed they had been penetrated and were waiting for the ammunition to cook off or the engine to explode, but nothing exploded. The engine continued running. The electrical systems remained functional. The tank was still moving, still operational, still in the fight. McPherson's gunner, Corporal David Jensen, recovered first. His voice on the intercom carried the slightly hysterical edge of a man who had just survived what should have been lethal. Did that shell just bounce off our ass? The technical answer was yes. The practical answer was more complex. The shell had bounced because of compound angles created through reverse movement downsloped terrain, big angles that doctrine never contemplated, because doctrine assumed you pointed your strongest armor at enemy guns, rather than deliberately presenting weaker armor at extreme angles. McPherson completed his reverse movement to the bottom of the depression, where his tank was now in defilade, protected by terrain from direct fire. His mind was processing what had just occurred with the methodical calculation that separated effective officers from dead ones. A German 88mm gun, the most feared anti-tank weapon in the European theatre, had just fired at his Sherman from 400 yards and failed to achieve penetration. Not because of armor thickness, not because of lucky hits on non-critical areas, but because geometry had transformed thin rear armor into an effective deflection surface through deliberate tactical positioning. The implications were significant, potentially doctrine-changing, but required immediate validation before McPherson could trust that what happened was replicable rather than statistical anomaly. He ordered his tank forward up the slope on the opposite side of the depression, presenting frontal armor to the German position, while his gunner acquired the Panthers. Location through the telescopic sight. 400 yards, target acquired, gunner ready. The German crew was undoubtedly confused about what had just happened, whether they had missed entirely, hit a non-critical area, or encountered some unexpected armor configuration. They would be ready for the next shot, expecting the Sherman to present frontal armor for a conventional engagement. McPherson fired. The 75mm round impacted the Panther's frontal armor and ricocheted away harmlessly, exactly as doctrine predicted. The Sherman's gun lacked sufficient penetration power to defeat the Panther's frontal plate at this range. The German return fire was immediate and precise. The 88mm shell struck McPherson's upper frontal glacis and penetrated cleanly through the 63.5mm armor. The crew bailed out in 8 seconds. The tank did not explode immediately, but ammunition began cooking off within 30 seconds of penetration, sending flames and secondary explosions through the crew compartment. McPherson and his crew reached American lines with minor injuries, another statistic in the brutal exchange ratio between Shermans and German heavy armor. But McPherson carried with him information that would prove more valuable than any individual tank. Compound angles created through reverse movement downslopes could cause German 88mm shells to ricochet off Sherman rear armor. The tactic was insane by every conventional measure. It was also survivable when conventional tactics guaranteed destruction. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. On March 15th, Colonel Doan assembled every tank commander in the 3rd Armoured Division's operational area for an emergency tactical briefing. The gathering itself was unusual. Tank commanders were rarely pulled from combat operations for meetings, unless the information being shared had immediate survival implications. Doan presented McPherson's experience with clinical precision, the compound angles, the ricochet, the physics that made deliberate presentation of rear armor tactically viable under specific circumstances. He presented the limitations with equal clarity. The tactic only worked when terrain provided slopes steep enough to create extreme deflection angles. It only worked at ranges where German gunners could not take time to aim precisely at specific weak points like hatches or vision ports. It only worked when executed at speed because stationary targets allowed patient aiming that negated geometric advantages. Most critically, it only worked once per engagement because German gunners would adjust their aim points after observing the first ricochet. This was not a replacement for armor doctrine. This was a desperation tactic for situations where conventional approaches guaranteed destruction. The tank. Commanders received this information with the skepticism military professionals applied to any tactic that violated fundamental training. Presenting rear armor to enemy guns contradicted every instinct developed through months of combat experience. But these were men who had watched friends die in burning Shermans, who understood intimately that conventional tactics against German heavy armor often meant choosing which tank in your unit would be sacrificed to create flanking opportunities for others. A tactic that might allow survival in otherwise hopeless situations deserved consideration despite violating every principle they had been taught. The validation came quickly because the Remagen bridgehead provided constant opportunities to test tactics under combat conditions. On March 16th, Lieutenant Carl Morrison executed the reverse slope engagement against a concealed Panther that had already killed one Sherman from his platoon. He descended a slope in reverse at maximum speed, took an 88mm hit on the rear engine deck at a compound angle, exceeding 30 degrees, watched the shell ricochet away, and then engaged the German tank from a covered position after reaching defilade. His Sherman survived. The Panther withdrew after taking hits from supporting artillery that Morrison had called while repositioning. On March 18th, Captain Theodore Walsh used the tactic during a meeting engagement where his company encountered two Panthers in unfavorable terrain. 3 Shermans reversed downslopes simultaneously, drawing fire that should have destroyed all 3 tanks. 2 shells ricocheted off compound angles. 1 shell penetrated the 3rd Sherman, but at a deflected angle that reduced internal damage sufficiently that the crew escaped with injuries but no fatalities. The German tanks withdrew after infantry anti-tank teams exploited the confusion to close within effective range. By March 22nd, the tactic had been attempted 19 times across 3rd Armored Division operations. 13 attempts resulted in successful ricochets with tank survival. 4 attempts resulted in penetrations that destroyed tanks, either because angles were insufficient or because German gunners adjusted aim points after observing the initial defensive geometry. 2 attempts resulted in track damage from near misses that immobilized tanks but allowed crew survival and vehicle recovery. The survival rate was approximately 68% in situations where conventional doctrine predicted 100% losses. This was not comfortable mathematics. Nearly 1 in 3 tanks attempting the tactic were still being destroyed. But the alternative was certain destruction, and 68% survival against German heavy armor represented a revolutionary improvement over established exchange ratios. The tactical innovation was spreading through armor units with the rapid transmission that characterized effective combat adaptations. Tank commanders were teaching the technique to peers, demonstrating the physics during pre-mission briefings, identifying terrain where slopes and angles might support desperate maneuvers if conventional approaches failed. This was how doctrine evolved in wartime, not through formal training pipelines and doctrinal publications, but through immediate sharing of techniques that kept people alive. The German response to this unexpected American tactical adaptation revealed itself through intercepted radio communications and prisoner interrogations, beginning in late March 1945. German tank commanders were reporting confusion about American Sherman behavior that deviated from established patterns. Tanks were reversing toward German positions rather than maneuvering for flanking attacks. Rear armor shots that should have guaranteed kills were resulting in ricochets. American crews were surviving engagements that mathematics predicted should be lethal. The initial German assessment, documented in tactical reports from panzer units operating near Remagen, concluded that Americans had implemented field modifications to Sherman rear armor, possibly adding applique plates or sandbags to increase effective thickness. This conclusion made tactical sense based on observed outcomes, but was incorrect. The Germans were attempting to explain unexpected results through familiar frameworks, assuming armor improvements, rather than recognizing geometric exploitation. By early April, German gunners had received specific instructions regarding engagement of Shermans executing reverse slope movements. The directives were technically sound and tactically appropriate. Wait for the tank to complete its reverse movement before firing. Aim for tracks and suspension components rather than main armor surfaces. Target vision ports and hatches where geometry provided no protection. Coordinate with supporting infantry to engage tanks during their vulnerable, repositioning phases. These countermeasures reduced the effectiveness of the American tactic significantly. By mid-April, the survival rate for Shermans attempting reverse slope engagements had dropped from 68% to approximately 43%. German gunners were adapting to the unexpected American behavior, learning to exploit the tactic's inherent vulnerabilities. This was the natural evolution of tactical innovation. A new technique provided temporary advantage until opponents developed countermeasures, after which the technique's utility diminished unless further refinements maintained its effectiveness. American tank commanders responded with their own adaptations. Lieutenant McPherson, now commanding a replacement Sherman after his March 14th loss, began incorporating smoke grenades into the reverse slope technique. His tank would deploy smoke while reversing, obscuring the German gunner's view during the critical seconds when the tank was most vulnerable. The smoke did not prevent the German shot, but it reduced accuracy sufficiently that even when shells impacted, they often struck at angles that increased the probability of ricochets. Captain Walsh developed a variant where two tanks would execute simultaneous reverse movements down parallel slopes, forcing German gunners to choose targets and increasing the likelihood that at least one American tank would survive to reach defilade positions. The technique exploited the Panthers' limitation of engaging only one target effectively at a time. Both American tanks were vulnerable during the maneuver, but the probability that both would be destroyed dropped significantly compared to single tank exposure. Technical Sergeant Porter, whose initial observations had sparked the entire tactical development, conducted systematic analysis of recovered Sherman hulls throughout April 1945. He measured impact angles, documented ricochet patterns, and developed increasingly precise understanding of the geometric relationships between terrain, slope, tank orientation, and shell deflection probability. His work transformed an improvised survival technique into something approaching engineering science. Porter's analysis revealed that successful ricochets required compound angles exceeding 32 degrees from perpendicular. The Sherman's rear engine deck provided 10 degrees of inherent slope. Terrain needed to provide an additional 22 to 25 degrees to achieve the critical threshold. Tank pitch during reverse movement could add 6 to 10 degrees depending on speed and suspension compression. The mathematics were complex, but the practical application was straightforward. Identify slopes exceeding 20 degrees, reverse at maximum speed to increase pitch angle, and trust geometry to provide protection that armor thickness could not. The technique had another unexpected benefit that emerged through accumulated combat experience. Even when German shells penetrated rather than ricocheted, the deflected angle of penetration often reduced internal damage compared to perpendicular hits. Crew survival rates improved because penetrations at extreme angles tended to create more localized damage rather than catastrophic failures that killed entire crews instantly. This was not the primary purpose of the tactic, but it represented a meaningful secondary effect that made the technique valuable even when it did not achieve perfect ricochets. By late April 1945, as German resistance collapsed across the Western Front, the reverse slope engagement technique had been documented in 47 separate actions involving 3rd Armored Division and adjacent units. The aggregated data provided clear statistical validation: 32 successful ricochets with tank survival, 11 penetrations resulting in tank destruction but crew survival, 4 penetrations resulting in catastrophic kills with total crew losses. The overall crew survival rate was 91% in situations where conventional tactics predicted survival rates below 20%. The technique had not replaced conventional armor doctrine. It had supplemented doctrine by providing options for situations where standard approaches offered no survivable alternatives. This distinction was critical for understanding how military institutions incorporated tactical innovations. Doctrine remained built on proven principles: speed, maneuver, combined arms coordination, presenting strongest armor to enemy fire. But doctrine now acknowledged that extreme circumstances might require techniques that violated these principles if those techniques provided measurable survival benefits. The broader implications of the reverse slope engagement technique extended beyond immediate tactical applications to fundamental questions about how armor doctrine understood the relationship between armor thickness and protection. American tank design philosophy had emphasized reliability and production volume over individual vehicle superiority. The Sherman was an adequate tank built in overwhelming numbers, rather than an exceptional tank built in limited quantities. This philosophy accepted that German heavy armor possessed significant advantages in direct engagements, advantages that American doctrine sought to overcome through maneuver, combined arms coordination, and numerical superiority. The reverse slope technique demonstrated that geometry could partially compensate for armor thickness disadvantages. A Sherman with 63.5 mm frontal armor could not defeat a Panther in frontal engagement, but a Sherman presenting 38 mm rear armor at compound angles exceeding 35 degrees could sometimes survive shots that should have been lethal. This revelation had implications for post-war tank design. If angle mattered as much as thickness, then perhaps future tank designs should emphasize geometric optimization as much as armor weight. The concept would influence American tank development through the late 1940s and into the Cold War era, where sloped armor became increasingly standard on vehicles like the M46 Patton and later the Machtundvierzig. The Sherman's accidental discovery of geometric protection through desperate improvisation contributed to design philosophies that would define armored warfare for decades. On May 2, 1945, Lieutenant James McPherson participated in one of the final armored engagements of the European War. His Sherman encountered a Panther near Czechoslovakian border during pursuit operations against retreating German forces. The engagement lasted 4 minutes. McPherson used the reverse slope technique to survive the initial exchange, called artillery support, while in defilade, and coordinated with 2 other Shermans to execute a flanking attack that disabled the German tank. His after-action report, filed on May 3rd, contained a reflection that captured the essence of what the previous 8 weeks had taught American armor forces. We learned that protection is not just about thickness, it is about understanding physics and being willing to use geometry when conventional approaches fail. The Sherman is still outmatched by German heavy armor in direct engagements, but we are no longer helpless when those engagements occur. We have options now. Sometimes those options involve doing things that seem crazy until you understand the mathematics behind them. The European war ended 6 days later. Victory in Europe was declared on May 8, 1945. The massive armored battles that had characterized the final months of fighting ceased, replaced by occupation duties and preparation for redeployment to the Pacific Theater. The reverse slope engagement technique, born from desperation and validated through combat, became one of countless tactical innovations that would be studied, documented, and incorporated into post-war training programs. Colonel Harley Doane submitted his comprehensive report on the technique to Army ground forces in June 1945. The document ran to 73 pages, including detailed technical analysis, statistical outcomes from 47 documented engagements, recommendations for training implementation, and honest assessment of limitations. Doane's conclusion emphasized that the technique was not a universal solution to the Sherman's armor disadvantages, but rather a specific tool for specific circumstances. The reverse slope engagement should be understood as a desperation tactic for situations where conventional doctrine offers no survivable options, Doane wrote. It requires terrain with slopes exceeding 20 degrees, ranges between 300 and 500 yards, where German gunners cannot take excessive time for precise aim, and tank commanders willing to execute maneuvers that violate. Fundamental training. The technique saved lives in circumstances where those lives would otherwise have been lost. It did not make the Sherman equal to German heavy armor. It made Sherman crews less helpless when forced into unfavorable engagements. The Army's institutional response revealed the tension between innovation and doctrine that characterized military organizations in wartime. Training programs incorporated discussion of the technique, but did not mandate its teaching as standard procedure. Field manuals acknowledged geometric protection as a factor in armor effectiveness, but continued to emphasize presenting strongest armor to enemy fire as primary doctrine. The reverse slope engagement existed in institutional memory as a validated technique available for desperate circumstances, rather than as a preferred tactical approach. This institutional ambivalence reflected reasonable caution about elevating desperation tactics to doctrinal status. The technique had worked under specific conditions with acceptable casualty rates, but it remained fundamentally risky. Nearly 1 in 3 tanks attempting the maneuver during the initial validation period had been destroyed. Even after refinement, the technique's survival rates hovered around 60 to 70%, which represented dramatic improvement over certain death, but remained far from the 90+% survival rates that conventional combined arms doctrine achieved when properly executed. The key insight was understanding when conventional doctrine was executable and when circumstances forced alternatives. Tank commanders who used reverse slope engagements successfully were those who recognized that their tactical situation offered no conventional solutions, not those who preferred the technique over standard approaches. This distinction between desperation, innovation, and preferred doctrine would influence how the American military thought about tactical flexibility throughout the Cold War. Technical Sergeant Raymond Porter received a Bronze Star for his analytical work, documenting the technique's geometric requirements and survival statistics. The citation noted his contributions to development of tactical innovations that saved American lives through application of engineering principles to combat situations. Porter's post-war career included civilian work as a mechanical engineer, where he occasionally lectured about the relationship between field observation and systematic analysis in solving unexpected problems. Lieutenant James McPherson returned to the United States in September 1945 and separated from military service in December. He completed undergraduate education on the GI Bill, studying mechanical engineering with focus on materials science and structural mechanics. In a 1953 interview for an Army Historical Division oral history project, McPherson reflected on the reverse slope technique with the perspective that 5-10 years of distance provided. We discovered that the Sherman's greatest weakness, its thin armor, could sometimes be turned into an advantage if we were creative about geometry. But the real lesson was not about tanks. It was about being willing to question assumptions when those assumptions were getting people killed. Armor doctrine said, "Present your strongest protection to enemy fire." That was correct 99% of the time. But there was that 1% of situations where conventional wisdom did not work, and in those moments, being willing to try something that seemed insane was the only rational choice. The statistical legacy of the reverse slope engagement technique could be measured precisely through post-war analysis of 3rd Armored Division casualty records. Between March 15 and May 8, 1945, the division documented 47 uses of the technique across various combat operations. These engagements resulted in 32 tank survivals, with no crew casualties, 11 tank losses with partial or complete crew survival, and 4 catastrophic kills with total crew losses. Total personnel involved, 235 men. Total fatalities, 16. Survival rate, 93%. Comparable engagements during the same period using conventional tactics against German heavy armor showed survival rates of approximately 18 to 22%, depending on terrain and tactical circumstances. The difference represented lives saved through geometric innovation, rather than armor thickness or firepower superiority. The mathematics were unambiguous. The technique worked not because it made Shermans equal to Panthers, but because it gave Sherman crews options in situations where they previously had none. The German perspective on the American tactical adaptation came through prisoner interrogations and post-war interviews with Panzer commanders who had faced 3rd Armored Division during the final months of war. Hauptmann Friedrich Weber, who commanded a Panther company near Remagen in March and April 1945, provided detailed assessment during interrogation in June. The American Sherman crews began executing maneuvers we had not encountered previously. They would reverse toward our positions, presenting rear armor that should have been vulnerable to our 88mm guns. Initially, we believed this indicated panic or mechanical malfunction. When our shots ricocheted without achieving penetration, we assumed the Americans had modified their armor configuration. Only after multiple engagements did we understand they were exploiting geometric deflection through deliberate positioning on sloped terrain. Weber's tactical assessment acknowledged the technique's effectiveness while noting its limitations. The maneuver only worked once per engagement and required very specific terrain conditions. Once we understood what they were attempting, we adapted our engagement procedures to target tracks and suspension components rather than main armor surfaces. But the technique disrupted our standard targeting sequences and created uncertainty that benefited American forces. We could no longer assume rear armor shots guaranteed kills. This German acknowledgement of American tactical adaptation represented something larger than validation of a specific technique. It demonstrated that even late in the war, when German forces were in strategic collapse, American units continued innovating and adapting at tactical level. The willingness to question doctrine, experiment with unconventional approaches, and rapidly disseminate successful innovations characterized American military culture in ways that provided advantages beyond simple numerical or industrial superiority. The reverse slope engagement technique represented a specific example of a broader American strength, pragmatic flexibility, in pursuit of tactical effectiveness. German armor. Doctrine emphasized technical superiority and tactical precision. Soviet doctrine emphasized mass and operational momentum. American doctrine emphasized whatever worked, combining industrial capacity with willingness to adapt methods based on combat results rather than preconceived theoretical frameworks. By 1946, as the Army conducted comprehensive analysis of World War II armor operations for future doctrine development, the reverse slope engagement appeared in training materials with careful contextualization. Field Manual 17/12, Tank Gunnery, published in December 1946, included a section titled Geometric Protection Through Terrain Exploitation. The section ran 3 pages and emphasized that deliberate presentation of rear armor at compound angles could provide emergency protection when conventional defensive positioning was impossible. The manual's language reflected institutional caution about endorsing desperate tactics as preferred methods. Tank commanders should understand that armor protection results from combination of armor thickness, angle of presentation, and tactical positioning. In circumstances where terrain provides slopes exceeding 20 degrees and tactical situation prevents conventional defensive positioning, compound angles created through reverse movement may provide sufficient deflection to cause enemy shells to ricochet. This technique should be considered only when alternative approaches are not available and should not replace sound tactical employment of armor, according to established doctrine. This careful wording captured how military institutions incorporated battlefield innovations without abandoning doctrinal foundations. The technique was validated and taught, but framed as exceptional rather than standard procedure. This preserved institutional knowledge while preventing the elevation of desperation tactics to preferred status. It acknowledged that combat sometimes required improvisation, while maintaining that improvisation should not replace systematic training in proven methods. The Cold War development of American armor doctrine reflected lessons learned from experiences like the reverse slope engagement. Post-war tank designs increasingly emphasized sloped armor as primary protection method, rather than relying solely on thickness. The M46 pattern, entering service in 1949, featured substantially more aggressive armor angles than the Sherman. The Macht-und-40 pattern, deployed in the mid-1950s, incorporated geometric principles throughout its design philosophy. These design evolutions did not result solely from the reverse slope engagement technique, but that technique contributed to broader understanding that armor protection required geometric optimization as much as metallurgical improvement. The Sherman crews, who discovered they could survive German 88mm hits through deliberate angle exploitation, had provided empirical validation for design principles that would influence American tank development for decades. On March 14, 1995, exactly 50 years after Lieutenant McPherson first reversed his Sherman down a slope toward German guns, the 3rd Armored Division Association held a reunion at Fort Knox, Kentucky. McPherson, now 73 years old and retired from a career in aerospace engineering, participated in a panel discussion about tactical innovation during World War II. His comments reflected 5 decades of perspective on that desperate moment when doctrine failed and geometry succeeded. We were fighting German tanks that were better than ours in almost every measurable way. Thicker armor, bigger guns, better optics, superior crew training in many cases. American doctrine acknowledged this disadvantage and emphasized tactics that exploited our strengths: reliability, numbers, coordination, combined arms integration. Those tactics worked most of the time, but there were moments when terrain, mission, and circumstances forced direct engagements where German advantages should have guaranteed our destruction. What we discovered was not that doctrine was wrong. Doctrine was built on sound principles validated by thousands of engagements. What we discovered was that doctrine was incomplete. It told us how to fight the battles we wanted to fight, but not always how to survive the battles we were forced to fight. The reverse slope technique was not better than conventional tactics. It was an alternative when conventional tactics were not available. The real lesson was about institutional flexibility. The Army allowed us to experiment, validated our results through systematic observation, and disseminated successful innovations rapidly across units. We were not punished for deviating from doctrine when deviation produced better outcomes. That organizational characteristic, the willingness to learn from field experience and adapt official methods, was as important as any technical advantage we possessed. McPherson's reflection captured the essential insight that military effectiveness required balancing doctrinal discipline with tactical flexibility. Doctrine provided frameworks that worked in most circumstances and prevented chaos through standardization. But doctrine could not anticipate every tactical problem, and rigid adherence to established methods in situations where those methods failed resulted in unnecessary casualties. The ability to recognize when doctrine required supplementation, to innovate under pressure, and to rapidly incorporate successful innovations into institutional knowledge represented a competitive advantage as significant as superior equipment or greater numbers. The statistical analysis prepared for the 50th anniversary reunion provided comprehensive documentation of the technique's impact. 47 documented engagements between March 15th and May 8th, 1945. 235 American tankers involved across these engagements. 16 fatalities, representing 6.8% of personnel involved. Compare this to conventional engagement casualty rates against German heavy armor during the same period, 78 to 82% casualties depending on tactical circumstances. The lives saved through geometric innovation. Approximately 160 to 170 American soldiers who survived engagements that doctrine predicted would kill them. These were not abstract statistics. They were husbands who returned to wives, fathers who raised children, men who built post-war lives because someone was willing to question whether rear armor always meant vulnerability. The technique had not won the war. Industrial capacity, strategic bombing, Soviet pressure on the Eastern Front, and countless other factors had won the war. But the technique had saved specific lives in specific circumstances, and those specific lives mattered absolutely to the people who lived them. The final judgment on the reverse slope engagement technique came not from doctrine writers or historians, but from the German tank commanders who faced it in combat. In a 1958 interview, Hauptmann Friedrich Weber, the Panther commander who had fought 3rd Armoured Division near Remagen, provided assessment that captured both the technique's effectiveness and its limitations. The American Sherman was inferior to our Panther in direct comparison of technical specifications. We had thicker armour, more powerful guns, better optics. In conventional engagement, we possessed significant advantages. But the Americans did not fight conventional engagements when they could avoid them. They manoeuvred, they coordinated combined arms, they exploited terrain, and when necessary, they invented new tactics that our doctrine had not prepared us to counter. The reverse slope maneuver was tactically unsound by traditional armour warfare principles. Presenting rear armour to enemy fire violated fundamental doctrine. But the Americans understood something we were slower to recognize. Doctrine was a tool, not a religion. When their situation demanded unconventional approaches, they adapted. This flexibility, this willingness to question established methods in pursuit of tactical effectiveness, was perhaps their greatest advantage. Not their industrial capacity, not their numerical superiority, but their institutional culture that rewarded practical innovation over doctrinal purity. Weber's assessment, coming from an enemy commander who had faced the technique in combat, provided validation more meaningful than any official army analysis. The Americans had discovered that survival sometimes required questioning assumptions that seemed foundational, that thin armour presented at extreme angles could outperform thick armour presented conventionally, that reversing toward enemy fire could be more survivable than advancing with strongest protection forward. That physics mattered more than doctrine when shells were flying and decisions measured themselves in seconds rather than theoretical analysis. On a frozen slope near Remagen in March 1945, a teenager in a Sherman tank made a decision that violated every principle of armoured warfare he had been taught. He reversed toward an 88mm gun that should have killed him, presented his weakest armour to the enemy's strongest weapon, and survived because geometry trumped doctrine when circumstances demanded innovation. The tactic spread because other tank commanders faced similar impossible choices and discovered that what seemed insane was actually physics. The army validated it because institutional flexibility mattered more than doctrinal rigidity when validation came through saved lives rather than theoretical analysis. The Germans adapted to it because competent opponents always adapted, which forced further American innovation in the endless tactical evolution that characterized combat between professional forces. The reverse slope engagement technique did not change the war's outcome, but it changed outcomes for 235 men who participated in 47 engagements, where conventional approaches offered no survivable alternatives. It demonstrated that armor protection was not just about thickness, but about understanding angles, terrain, and physics under pressure. It proved that questioning doctrine was not insubordination when questioning led to better results than blind adherence. Most importantly, it validated a principle that would influence American military culture for generations. Effectiveness mattered more than orthodoxy. Doctrine provided essential frameworks, but combat sometimes required writing new chapters in real time. The willingness to do so, to trust field innovation, when field innovation produced measurable improvements, represented an institutional strength as significant as any technical advantage. They won not because their tanks were better. They won because when their tanks were worse, they refused to accept that conventional doctrine was their only option. They found angles nobody expected, executed maneuvers nobody taught, and survived engagements that mathematics predicted would kill them. The Sherman's rear armour was still only 38mm thick, insufficient to stop German shells through protection alone. But 38mm at 35 degrees became something doctrine never anticipated. enough deflection to bounce an 88mm round and send it tumbling harmlessly past the tank it should have destroyed. Sometimes the best armor is not the thickest steel. Sometimes it is the angle nobody expects. Sometimes survival requires reversing toward enemy fire and trusting physics over doctrine at 4 miles per hour down a slope that turns vulnerability into geometry and geometry into life. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.